For those who grew up at the very height of the Cold War, you may have some vivid memories of having to practice duck and cover drills for when the missiles start flying. You may also have memories of headlines with warning of the Red Scare. For those who grew up in the Eastern Bloc, your memories will be very, very similar, obviously, just from the different perspective. But what happens after the bombs fly? Does the world just end? Multimedia would often have you think so, that nuclear war would be the end of everything. Or perhaps it'll have you thinking that we will run around fighting giant cockroaches and getting shot at by ghouls and being chased by deathclaws and, going through that one path in Fallout New Vegas that every new player goes through and then has PTSD over for the rest of their lives. But what if I told you that many countries prepare for what comes after? That they prepare on how to rebuild after the wars, which could really well signal an end to our planet. The USSR being absolutely no exception. And how would you rebuild a country after a nuclear I can't say the cost word. After a nuclear kerfuffle? Well, it would take a lot of effort. And the rebuilding of the Union, after the bombs fell, would have to be done on the back of something strong to support the logistics network. And that was the Steam Reserve. A fleet of zombie steam trains to bring back the Soviet Union from the dead. Okay, there's a little PSA here for some very specific people, generally of the baby boomer variety. Using the term train to describe this or this is fine. Now, this will undoubtedly upset some of you and leave you completely foaming at the mouth, but to that I raise you the following. When you hear somebody talk about a car, do you then turn around to them and absolutely freak out and go, "This is not a car, it's an automobile. How dare you? You don't understand, you're not an enthusiast like the rest of us. You're not good enough, it's not a car, it's an automobile." Because that's what you sound like progressively. You sound like you're absolutely foaming at the mouth and stupid. Because guess what? Not everyone is completely psychotic like you are. When people say train, they get happy because train. Using the term train in 2025 is an informal term that is widely accepted and used by people around the world. If you go out in public and you see a little kid point and say train, and then you absolutely foam at the mouth and start shouting at them, you will get arrested, and honestly that's for the best. Go outside and touch grass if you can't get over this, or proceed to bitch in the comments. Either way, it gives me free engagement, so we're bringing back Salty Ho for 5 minutes because I'm sick of dealing with stupid people. Anyway, now that the absolute, special kind of people have left us, and it's just people who want to learn a bit about history without, jumping on a high horse that's bigger than Farlap, we will continue. The start of the Cold War is a bit of a finicky thing that most academic historians can't really agree on. See, some argue that it began in 1945 when Germany surrendered, others argue that it started in 1943 when Soviet spies actively were at work in Allied nations, taking away intel, think Bletchley Park or the Manhattan Project, and some say it didn't really begin until the Berlin Wall went up and everything, before that was just posturing. In my opinion, as one of those academic people in the crowd, because yes, I did throw thousands of dollars away to get the fancy off-white coloured piece of paper, I would say the Cold War began in the 40s and escalated into the 50s. When the USSR tested its first atomic weapon, things really kicked off. This test of an atomic weapon by the Soviets naturally terrified the world, in particular the West. The thought that two powers who stood on opposite sides of the aisle were poised to strike, both holding the power of the atom in their hands, it was terrifying. But it wasn't all doom and gloom just yet. Because in those early days it required a large bomber to deliver the payload to the target, giving both powers time to react and hopefully shoot the bomber down. Now, naturally as well, with bombers as well, you kind of get the idea that a nuclear exchange in those early days would have been much more militarily tactical rather than, just blowing, your entire civilian population of another country to hell. But of course this all changed when the USSR launched the R-7 rocket, and in return the US responded with Redstones and Titan IIs. By 65, both superpowers could, with the press of a button or turn of a key, launch weapons that could utterly devastate the other in ways that can only be described as biblical. This of course created an interesting, but never before considered question. How does a country come back after the bombs fall? No, Timmy, put the copy of Fallout down, there is no big iron on his hip. But there is one on the rails. The disaster at Chernobyl in 1986 gives you a bit of an idea about the problems that face a nation where there is widespread nuclear waste from a disaster. The biggest problem is that radiation and radioactive material is not a simple thing you can just clean up. You can't just sweep it into a dustpan and brush and put it in the bin. It gets on everything. So much so that if you let it sit in the ground, the entire layer of topsoil turns, well, it's a bit spicy. To really clean it all up and fix the problems, you have to do many things like overturn soil. Without that, you'll end up in the situation where your farmland is growing poison for your people. Chernobyl itself required an army of men to actively fight a war against the poison, and even then, the entire region is uninhabitable and will remain this way for centuries. But that's just one city, where the superpower is still able to respond. A nuclear war is so much worse. There's actually an old movie from 1983 called The Day After. It's the American version of the British movie Threads, which in itself is the most horrifying thing you could ever possibly sit and watch on TV, and do not watch it in front of your children, for the love of God. Anyway, The Day After is a direct-to-TV film, and it's set in the United States, particularly in rural Kansas, and it shows the aftermath of a nuclear exchange. The whole movie is brilliant and so well made that it actually led to the, of all people, President Ronald Reagan changing his stance on nuclear confrontation. But one particular scene that I vividly remember from this film, and I'll always remember, is that the farmers being stood together and told that they have to dig up a massive layer of topsoil to get rid of it and to grow crops again so they wouldn't kill the people they sell the crops to. They then sat there confused as all hell trying to figure out how they were going to do this without heavy machinery because the nuclear bombs had just wiped out the electricity grid and nothing was running. The film then cuts away following others, and it shows just how, without logistical connections to the central government and infrastructure grid, that the country had devolved into a looting, squatting, and, well, just in general, a lot of violence and death. Although, of course, this is all fiction, and touch wood, it remains that way, it does show the aftermath of an exchange would have some very specific issues. So that leaves us sitting back in the 1960s, and in the USSR, a country that at the time was working very hard to move into the modern era as a new and modern state. Although rapidly modernising in the post-war era and thawing under Khrushchev, the country was still only really held together east and west by a single lifeline, the Trans-Siberian Railway. A railway that, if it was broken or made inoperable, would be disastrous for Moscow's rule over the east, a part of the country that was now even more important to the USSR given the Cold War and its proximity to Western allies in, South Korea and also Japan. Not a lot has really changed from modern Russia, mind you. To this day, the entire spine of the country truly is held together by trains. But in the 50s and 60s, this was especially true. See, air travel had not yet reached a point where it could remotely compete with a train's ability to move cargo and people. Sure, it was faster, but efficiency-wise, the train still ruled. The key issue was, though, that the massive trains crisscrossing the USSR at this time were mostly steam, and that led to the need of so much more infrastructure being built. The adoption of a reliable diesel and electrical engines in the 60s really fixed this problem for the Soviets. They could now reliably and quickly run trains east and west with massive cargoes and relatively few crews, with little support and little need to, stop and resupply all the time. But that raises the next point. What happens if you totally replace your network with these new diesels and electrics, and then something happens that removes your ability to pump diesel or to electrify your tracks? You're a bit stuck. This was a genuine fear in the USSR because if those trains stop running, you lose the ability to get fuel in your trucks, and then you're back to horses. So how do you fix it? Well, you look to the past, because a good old-fashioned steam train could run, and still will run with no electricity and no power. You just need something to burn in it. Coal ideally, but wood works too. And Siberia, well, it's covered in wood, so you can do that as well. It's not just Siberia, mind you, though, because if you look around the USSR, the majority of rail connections are in the west of the country. The ability to connect Kyiv, Minsk, Leningrad, and Moscow in the aftermath of a nuclear war would be undoubtedly immense, even if the Soviets had to cannibalize most of their tracks just to get a single rail connection. The logic was incredibly sound, and so the USSR set about building a reserve of steam engines across the country. When I say around the country too, I mean literally everywhere. In yards, on sidings, along random railways, in small towns, at old unused tunnels. You name it, there's a train there. Hell, I'm willing to take a bet if you checked inside of the average babushka's Compot collection at the time, you'd find an old steam train that's just sitting there raring to go. These steam engines were not simply remnants of a bygone age, they were a key strategic asset, ready to be deployed in a time of crisis when modern systems failed. Of course, in a full-scale war, where the entire world was plunged into a nuclear winter, this would all amount to effectively nothing, given the fact, everyone would be dead. But in a scenario where nuclear strikes destroyed power grids, disrupted oil supplies, or rendered electronic systems inoperable through EMPs, the Soviet Union would need a backup transportation system that would continue functioning independently of fragile infrastructure. Steam trains powered by coal or wood or mechanically operated offered a rugged and time-tested solution. The only limiting factor would really be the need for crews, and this could be supplemented by the fact that the average person could be press-ganging to working as a stoker, and also water. Water would be an issue, but then again there's an upside to that, is that you don't have to clean the radiation off the water to use it in the steam train. You can just, pump it in, so any surface level water reserve will work, and they won't actually be used for drinking water because they will be incredibly poisonous, so the access to water, well, that largely fixes itself. As for fuel, well, you could use wood, old tables, oil, coal, paper mill rolls. There's so many things you can burn to make an old engine work. It won't run at its optimum speeds and you'll damage the boiler, but if you've got so many steam engines in reserve, you can afford to sacrifice a few. There are so many things you can do to make these zombie trains work, and they would be able to work. They would stand up like zombies, back from the dead from their long retirements, and bring the USSR back to life on their backs. The Soviet Reserve Steam Fleet was really not just a token gesture. By the 1970s, the USSR had gathered thousands of steam locomotives and set about retaining them in a form of cold storage. These engines were kept in special depots across the country, often in rural or mountainous areas far from likely nuclear targets. Each depot would house dozens of steam locomotives, sometimes kept indoors in controlled environments to reduce rust and degradation, but like I said before, many were just left anywhere there was space, even if it was in the open. Importantly, these locomotives were not simply mothballed and left to rot and decay, a lesson that the modern Russian Navy might want to learn. These old Soviet steamers were periodically serviced by mechanics, fired up and even run under load to ensure they remained operational at all times. They also had specific trains set aside that they could be used as spare parts to cannibalize to keep the operational trains working at once. Specialised railway personnel were assigned to maintain these locomotives, and a cadre of engineers and operators were trained in steam locomotive operation, long after such skills had largely vanished from the regular railway workforce. These men were also largely kept from coalescing together, meaning that if some of them were wiped out in the strikes, they could then teach others through, press ganging, to operate the vehicles. The reserve was structured similarly to military readiness standards. Some locomotives were maintained at high readiness, meaning that they could be operational within 12 to 24 hours. Others might require a few days of preparation. Others, well, they were effectively in long-term cold storage. In times of increased geopolitical tensions, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, these engines would sometimes be inspected or tested with greater frequency. It really was like a reserve fleet or National Guard of choo-choo. But Mr. So-called history of everything, you may say, why can't you just show us what kinds of engines there were? Why do you have to tell us about the history of the network? Well, I hear you, so let's talk about the chugga-chuggers. The steam reserve primarily consisted of locomotives from the early years of the Soviet steam development, but make no mistake, there were examples of engines from all the way back from the earliest days of the Soviet Union and the late Russian Empire. Among the most common designs kept throughout were the SO series, or the Sergo or that series, known for reliability and ease of maintenance. Of course, the FD series, which is the ones we covered briefly in the AA-20 video, because these were the most powerful freight locomotives that actually worked, not looking at you AA-20, that saw widespread use in the Soviet Union. They were incredibly well made, they were made in huge numbers, and they were very, very powerful. Then you've got the L series, which was one of the most modern Soviet steam designs built in the post-war period and used heavily across the network until the diesels finally came in. And lastly, you've got the P36 series, often referred to as the general locomotives that were used for passenger services, and featured more sophisticated engineering, including streamlining. Now, granted, the P36s weren't the best, but, any train will do in the post-apocalyptic world. Also, imagine a Soviet Fallout aesthetic, mixed with Metro on a P36. I think it would look pretty cool, personally. These locomotives were generally standardized, which simplified the storage and maintenance of spare parts. Large caches of coal and water, along with fuel oil for heating boilers, were also kept near reserve depots to ensure rapid deployment, but of course these finite resources would run out pretty quickly in an exchange. The very existence of the steam reserve was classified during the Cold War. Western intelligence had only vague knowledge of the depot's existence, and their locations were rarely marked on civilian maps. Even within the USSR itself, knowledge of the reserves was compartmentalised. Engineers and workers assigned to steam reserves were often sworn to secrecy, and the facilities were guarded like military installations. The secrecy also meant very little documentation existed in the public archives until after the collapse of the USSR. In the post-Soviet years, researchers and railway enthusiasts began uncovering the remains of reserve depots, often finding the vehicles still intact, although very, very rusted through and vandalised, sitting in forgotten sheds or overgrown sidings. This is why you see so many videos and photos of abandoned trains with red stars on them online. They're parts of the old Soviet steam reserve. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the beginning of the end for the steam reserves. Economic hardship, a lack of strategic direction, and the privatisation of the railway system led to the abandonment or scrapping of most of the reserve locomotives. And it does make sense given the risk of nuclear war was next to nothing compared to the height of the Cold War. Was next to nothing. By the late 1990s, only a handful of depots still retained operational steam engines, mostly for ceremonial or tourism purposes. Many of the trains were actually sold or given to museums. However, the idea behind the steam reserve has lived on as a fascinating example of Cold War contingency planning. The sheer scale and seriousness in which the Soviet Union approached the possibility of total war is reflected in the meticulous preparation and the preservation of an outdated but invaluable technology. Today, a few former reserve locomotives have actually been restored and operate on heritage railways in the former Soviet states. The thing about strategic steam reserves in the USSR, though, is that it wasn't a bad idea. I know you're used to me saying, haha, Russia do stupid thing, but in reality, it makes perfect and logical and reasonable sense, especially for a country that is so reliant on rail connections. It's so common, in fact, and so smart of a thing to do when you are, desperately prepping for what comes after the nuclear winter, that there are rumours and urban legends that the British also apparently have a steam reserve. This myth spawned in about 1968 when steam was withdrawn from mainline service, and it persisted for decades, although the myth was never really proven. It remained with some people saying that certain tunnels were full of secretly preserved engines, just waiting for the moment that things would change and they would be needed. The reality is, though, that steam still has an important place in the UK, because although the strategic reserve never existed there, never proved to exist there, many engines were kept in running order by steam enthusiasts, and they have responded before when needed. Other countries that actually kept a reserve other than the USSR include places like Finland and Sweden, mostly for the same reason as the Soviets, although their reserves existed to keep military infrastructure running in the event of a Soviet invasion. But that's it. That's the story of the USSR's zombie train fleet, the secret plan to use old technology to bring the USSR back to life from the brink. I hope you all enjoyed Traintober. There's still technically one more video to go, and that's about the C-17 class locomotive, the best steam train ever made, and I'll explain why that statement is true, and you can't refute it no matter how hard you try in the video. Until then though, let me know what you thought about having a whole month dedicated to one topic. If you really like it, then maybe we can do something like Tanktember or Tank Mass in December. Just let me know. Like, comment, subscribe, please consider checking out my Patreon. If you're going to complain that I called it a train, go ahead. No one can save you, and I'm just going to say it again, go touch grass, and I will catch you all next time.